Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Labs 2024 Call for Ideas webinar. Before we start, just a few reminders. This webinar is being live streamed on YouTube and will be available on demand afterward. We'll send you the video link and slides. Today, we'll walk you through the Labs Call for Ideas, which is open until December 27. You'll learn about the lab process, selection criteria, and our priority areas and regions. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A feature on Zoom, not the chat. You'll find the icon on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to turn it over to Arun Krishnan, who leads the lab regional program in India. Arun, over to you.
Thank you, Julian. Hi all, it's always an exciting time for our team to kick off a new lab cycle. And seeing the growing attention the lab is getting is really encouraging. We look forward to helping you improve and target your submissions, helping ensure this cycle is as impactful as possible, and hopefully making all our lives a little easier. Climate Policy Initiative, or CPI, our mission is to help governments, businesses, and financial institutions drive growth while addressing climate change. We are a global institution with offices in Brazil, India, Indonesia, the UK, and the US. The lab is one of our flagship programs. Thanks for being here and for your interest in the lab. Let's get started with today's agenda. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll start by explaining how the lab works and how it helps develop climate finance instruments from idea to pilot. And when I say climate finance instruments, I also mean servitization model. So although I may not repeat servitization model in my presentation, but please understand that not only do we deal with climate finance instruments, but also with climate-related servitization models. After my part of the presentation, Megan will walk you through what the lab is looking for in 2024, detailing our regional programs and global thematic streams. And after that, Hesam will review a couple of successful applications and detail key questions on the submission form. Following the presentation, we invite all of you to ask questions. And of course, during the presentation, you can start typing your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll address them after the presentation. Next slide, please. With that, let me start by introducing you to the lab program. Next slide. Climate finance is essential to fighting the climate crisis, as limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires massive private investment. A new study from CPI shows that annual climate finance flows surpassed $1 trillion for the first time in 2021, 6 years after the Paris Agreement was adopted. The green line on the graph shows the annual average climate finance flows in 2021-22, which reached almost $1.3 billion. This is double the amount of climate finance that was invested in 2019-2020. The yellow area on the graph shows the amount of climate finance that is needed annually by 2030 to avoid the worst impact of climate change. This amount is at least 5 times higher than the current level of climate finance flows. But despite the seemingly dramatic scale of the funding gap, it represents less than 5% of global GDP. Next slide, please. We can't reach trillions of dollars in investment by only involving governments and philanthropies. Private capital is also essential. That's why the lab was created in 2014 to identify and develop innovative financial mechanisms and servitization models that can attract private capital into climate change mitigation and adaptation in developing economies. The idea is to use small amounts of grants and concessional capital to kickstart operations and then grow these into self-sustaining instruments that can create significant impact at scale while achieving commercial viability. So far, we have launched 68 instruments that have included funds, facilities, guarantees, bonds, insurance, credit products, and more, all of which share a common vision to leverage limited public or concessional capital to unlock private investment at scale. Next slide, please. So far, Lab Ideas have mobilized over $3.5 billion since we launched the lab 10 years ago. This includes $1.2 billion invested by members and observers who are part of the lab network. Finance from the lab network unlocks significant co-investment, with close to 50% of the $3.5 billion mobilized coming from commercial banks and institutional investors, the very sources of capital that we desperately need in emerging market climate projects. 85 public and private investors have plowed their capital into 36 lab ideas that have attracted financing, a 57% capital mobilization rate that we are very proud of. This means that the lab creates a pipeline of bankable ideas that successfully mobilize additional financing. Next slide, please. The lab's theory of change revolves around collaboration between public and private sectors, openly sourcing concepts from finance innovators, and a powerful network to move the ideas into action. Next slide, please. The lab model draws heavily on its membership, which includes high-level representatives from over 70 government, investment banks, insurance companies, project developers, and development finance institutions from across the world. Lab members are tasked with selecting ideas and supporting the design and piloting of selected ideas in several ways throughout the lab process. Climate Policy Initiative is the lab secretariat and provides analytical support to beneficiaries. Next slide, please. Let me explain in a bit more detail how the lab works. First, we have an annual open call for innovative investment solutions and servitization models, which is what we are doing right now. Anyone can apply, and we have received hundreds of ideas from a wide range of potential beneficiaries, including startups, entrepreneurs, boutique fund managers, large public and private institutions, academics, nonprofits, and NGOs. The lab's call for ideas is truly open to all innovators across the globe. Once the call for ideas closes in December, and in this year it is December 27, we screen the submissions to ensure they meet our criteria. Lab members vote to select the most promising ideas that meet the lab criteria. We will detail the lab criteria in a bit. At the development stage, the secretariat, that is CPI, lab members and working groups comprised of other expert partners with partner with the selected ideas over several months to develop these concepts into bankable financial solutions. Once the analysis is complete, the lab members vote to endorse the final instrument. This signals the fact that the instrument is ready to be launched and that the lab fully supports the idea. The focus then shifts to implementation support phase. This is where we help the endorsed instruments get off the ground by fundraising and providing support from the lab network. CPI provides an additional year of targeted support, analysis, and investor matchmaking for the beneficiary. Next slide, please. Our website has much more information, including detailed guidelines and an FAQ. We are posting those links in the chat right now. I will now turn it over to Megan Sager, the lab senior consultant for East and Southern Africa program, to introduce the 2024 lab call for ideas and give you an overview of what the lab is looking for. Over to you, Megan.
Fantastic. Thanks, Arun, and great to see so many of you joining us online today. So firstly, to give you an idea of how ideas submitted to the lab are assessed, lab ideas are selected based on a set of 5 key criteria. On actionability, we look for ideas that demonstrate involvement of entities able to implement the idea with relevant experience. Secondly, with a clear pathway to implementation, including a defined timeframe, key activities, and project milestone. And thirdly, identification of potential risks to implementation and strategies for dealing with them. This last element we'll deal with in a few slides with an example question from the questionnaire. For catalytic potential, which we define in the lab context as the ability of the idea to mobilize private sources of climate finance, ideas should demonstrate both the potential for scale-up of private investment in the target markets and the ability or potential to replicate in other markets. Thirdly, innovation. Successful lab ideas will demonstrate how the idea addresses barriers to climate finance that have either not been addressed yet or will dismantle them more effectively than existing approaches in the target markets. In essence, here we are looking for submissions that clearly articulate how the idea submitted adds to other efforts in the space. Then regarding financial sustainability, high-quality lab ideas will have a clear strategy for phasing out public and philanthropic finance over time, achieving market viability on commercial terms, even if that runway is long in some cases. Instruments should also identify challenges and risks in achieving these objectives and strategies for managing them. Lastly, we also look for ideas where the lab has a significant value add to the success of the instruments and of the proponent team implementing the idea. This means that the capabilities of the lab team and network complement the proposing team's capabilities and needs. It also requires the proponent team to have sufficient time available and a governance structure which enables participation in the lab process. Now, more specifically about the current call for ideas, next year we'll have the largest lab cycle ever with 10 ideas to celebrate the lab's first decade in 2024. The lab is introducing 2 new regional programs, one in Latin America and Caribbean, and another in the Philippines, as well as launching a new thematic global stream targeting high-intensity forests. They build on the positive experience with the consolidated regional programs in Brazil, India, and Eastern Southern Africa. On the global themes, we are reintroducing the Agriculture and Food Systems Lab stream, which is now a partnership with Climate Shots Investor Coalition, or CLIC. The lab also offers 1 global adaptation spot targeting any emerging market. The lab has updated its traditional wildcard slots to focus exclusively on climate mitigation, specifically energy and infrastructure. So now let's dive a little deeper. First, the regional programs. The lab introduced its first regional program in India in 2015, gradually expanding into Brazil, then Eastern Southern Africa. The regional programs have developed 29 solutions over the years, making up 40% of the lab's portfolio. These programs allow the lab to focus on local contexts and priorities, addressing country-specific investment needs and barriers. They leverage national networks of highly capable financiers and implementers with deep knowledge of local markets. To qualify for either program, your idea should primarily target one of the markets, regardless of the sector. All regional programs will select 1 idea each, the exception being Latin America and Caribbean, which will select 2, one for mitigation and the other for adaptation. The global themes will also select 1 idea each, totaling 4 across the program. These streams focus on sector-specific climate investment needs and barriers. We're talking about solutions that accelerate climate finance for businesses and organizations in agriculture and food system sectors, innovative financial instruments that support the scale-up of private finance, build climate resilience, climate finance ideas focused on monetizing high-integrity forests, and for the climate mitigation theme, scalable solutions in renewable energy, low-carbon transit, buildings, industrial sectors, and just energy transition, including the phase-out of coal and fossil fuel. Eligible ideas should target emerging markets, but not necessarily the same as those in the regional program. Next, I'm going to turn over to my colleague Haitham Azar, analyst at CPI, who will walk us through successful applications and detail key questions on the submission form. Over to you, Haitham.
Thanks very much, Megan, and a warm welcome to all joining us today. Now, to illustrate the evaluation of ideas submitted in practice, I'll share 2 examples of past lab instruments that were selected and successfully went through the lab process and eventually were endorsed. First, cooling as a service was proposed to be part of the 2019 cycle of the lab by the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy and the Clean Cooling Collaborative. The instrument is a pay-for-service model to decrease energy consumption and HFC emissions from cooling systems by making more efficient cooling technologies more accessible to customers. Cooling as a service stood out as being highly actionable with demonstrable team experience, an executed MOU with a local partner, and evidence in the submission that it did not rely on new legislation. It was highly catalytic with significant potential for scale, given projections that the global air conditioning market will triple by 2050 and a clear case for private investment. Moreover, it was innovative as it applied the pay-for-service model to a new market, cooling, and articulated how it improved on existing financial approaches for clean cooling. And finally, it demonstrated high potential for financial sustainability as it was clear how it could become a fully commercial solution that would not rely on grant capital. Moving on to the second example, Conservation International proposed the Restoration Insurance Service Company, or RISCO, in the same cycle as Cooling as a Service, which was 2019. RISCO is a social enterprise that invests in mangrove conservation and restoration in areas with high-value coastal assets, protecting blue carbon and reducing flooding and property damage risk. RISCO, like Cooling as a Service, stood out as being highly actionable with a team with a proven record in the space, a submission that clearly articulated implementation milestones, and evidence that it would not rely on new legislation being passed in target markets. It was highly catalytic with a concept already underway for scaling up operations and early estimates completed of market size and impacts. Moreover, it was highly innovative as the submission demonstrated that it was a novel approach to pricing the benefits of mangrove restoration with the potential for climate impact that improves on existing solutions. And finally, it had potential for financial sustainability as barriers to commercial viability were clearly identified and strategies to overcome them articulated, and the plan for use of grant capital delineated. Both of these ideas also clearly articulated in their submissions how the lab process could bring value to their efforts to implement. And it was clear that the teams proposing the ideas had sufficient capacity to engage as part of the lab process. With that, let's now move on to specific guidance on a number of key questions in the application questionnaire. Zooming in on the lab application itself, I'll now walk through 3 examples of what we look for when reviewing key application questions, along with sample responses from submissions that the lab ultimately selected. Beyond assessing how actionable, catalytic, financially sustainable, and innovative your idea is, we'll also look to ensure that the lab is well suited to support you in developing your idea. For example, the lab does not provide direct funding for selected instruments, so only applicants seeking technical assistance from the lab will be considered. This technical assistance amounts to $200,000 of in-kind support provided over the course of the lab process, which is 7 months, with a small budget for continued support for a year after endorsement. To gauge whether the lab is a good fit for your idea, the application asks for your objectives in applying for the lab and how the lab process can help you achieve those goals. Before answering this question, we recommend you review the lab's impact report on our website. So you'll find specific examples of how the lab has previously supported instruments. Once you've had a look at the impact report, you should frame your response in the context of how the lab's technical assistance offerings can help you develop your idea. Note that the highlighted text in the sample response at the bottom of the slide clearly outlines how the lab can assist by stress testing the concept and assessing risks to implementation. When reviewing your responses, we'll also want to ensure that the lab's core competencies and value offerings are well suited to meet your needs. Note that the sample response at the bottom of the slide references 2 areas of the lab's value proposition: blended finance expertise and knowledge of impact KPIs. Next, to make sure that you are well equipped to fully engage throughout the course of the lab process, and more importantly, to assess whether you're willing and able to implement your idea following the conclusion of the lab process, we'll ask what resources you plan to commit to developing your idea. One of the first things we look for is buy-in from high-level staff, such as department heads or managing partners, as highlighted in the example at the bottom of the slide. Demonstrating high-level buy-in will help alleviate concerns that organizational priorities may shift away from instrument development, especially during the lab process. We'll also want to see that developing your idea into an actionable financial instrument is the primary responsibility of at least one core member of your team. The lab process is highly collaborative, so it's crucial that we have a reliable point of contact who will prioritize the lab process and is empowered to make key instrument design decisions. Finally, we'll need to see what you're committed to. We'll need to see that you're committed to developing the idea in the long term. The core lab process lasts only 7 months, which is far shorter than the time it takes to fully develop and launch a new financial instrument. We'll need to see that you're willing and able to dedicate sufficient long-term resources to implement your idea after the core lab cycle concludes. Implementation is a full-time job that will require significant long-term resources, such as a fully dedicated team, as described in the sample response at the bottom of the screen. Finally, we look to gauge the extent to which you've thought through the risks to implementing your idea and the strategies you'll employ to address those risks. When answering this question, it's important that you be transparent with us. This example response highlights risks that are genuinely challenging to overcome. All instruments face material challenges like currency risk and unexpected economic shocks. So addressing some really tough challenges directly is important rather than minimizing or avoiding them entirely. Next, you'll want to identify mitigation strategies that are uniquely tailored to address the risks that you outline. It's helpful to have a diversified risk mitigation strategy, and note that this sample response describes 2 strategies used in tandem to address currency risk. Strong submissions will also demonstrate strategies that indicate differentiation from the market. For example, the sample response at the bottom of the slide highlights how the applicant planned to use proprietary data and modeling tools to respond to changing market dynamics. And now I'll hand it over to Arun to kick off the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hazen. So we will have questions now. I can see some questions already in the Q&A box, but feel free to ask more questions so that the process and the benefits that the lab can bring to your idea, it is known better. So just to reiterate what Hazen had mentioned, the lab does not offer any funding, right? So what we offer is analytical support, support for to grow your ideas, right? So we do not offer any direct funding. However, our experience has been that many of the ideas which got selected to the lab, they got funding from other sources because of the brand name of the lab, which we have built up over the last 10 years. So funders, financiers, they already know that the idea has some legs, and which is why it got selected in the lab process. And therefore, you can, hope to improve your chances in getting other sorts of funding. Okay. We will go to the questions, although we have answered 2 questions already, but perhaps we can go through the answers again. So Ketan has asked, are high integrity forests also a theme for regional programs, or are they intended for global programs? So regional programs are geography based. So you have Brazil, India, Southern and Eastern Africa, but also LATAM mitigation, LATAM adaptation, and Philippines, right? So for those programs, an applicant need not be from those geographies. You can be from anywhere in the world, but the ideas have to be implemented in those geographies. right? So that is what is meant by regional program. So you can be sitting in Europe, but you have a great idea which might work in Philippines. So you can apply for the Philippines regional program. The thematic streams, which is high integrity forests and so on, they are global programs, right? So you can sit anywhere in the globe and you can hope to implement this idea anywhere in the globe, and you can apply for those ideas, right? Sometimes there will be an overlap between the two. Okay, so maybe you have an idea which might work in Brazil, but it might also work in, I don't know, Croatia or something, right? And it also hits upon high integrity forests. Okay, then you have to make a decision on applying for which stream is your strongest point, right? Is your idea more strongly suited for high integrity forests, or is it more strongly suited for the Brazil geography, right? So if you make that decision, it becomes easy for you to think about which stream you want to apply for. Okay.
Arun, let me quickly jump in and sort of just expand on your response a little bit. So, you know, while we will defer to you on which, you know, sort of global sort of thematic stream or regional program you wish to apply to, the lab might also internally make a determination as to which global stream or thematic stream your idea is most sort of suited to. So it'll be a combination of you applying to the stream and us making that determination internally.
Okay, Karthik's question, could you please share the eligibility criteria? So Hesam, perhaps you can expand upon what you've written.
Happy to. So the idea should be a financial instrument, right? And what we define what a financial instrument is in our FAQ section on the website. In the context of the lab, I'm happy to expand on it here. A financial instrument is essentially a tool, structure, or approach to investment that has the potential to mobilize private capital. The lab does not support ideas for individual projects or the deployment of new technologies unless there is an innovative financial product that is associated with these projects or technologies. And so, you know, instruments that the lab has selected in the past include debt and equity funds, bonds, insurance products, guarantees. And so these are examples of the types of instruments that we've supported in the past. And to really get an idea of what we're looking for, I would highly encourage you to look at some of the past instruments that we display, that we feature in our portfolio section of the website.
Thank you, Hesam. Moving on to the next question. Beverly wants to know, will new food systems that address climate change be eligible? We are introducing regenerative agriculture and grazing in Kenya, a mirror model to produce commercially and simultaneously with local communities. Would that be eligible? So Megan, perhaps you can take this question. Beverly. Yeah.
Definitely. So Beverly, financing for food systems would be eligible, not the actual technology or production method. So bear in mind that the lab builds it seeks to develop financial instruments for change rather than the underlying technologies, processes, or methods employed for climate resilience or climate change.
Perfect. All right, let's move on. I'm going to club together Dilip's question and Karthik's question. So Dilip wants to know, sorry, where did that question go?
Apologies, Arun, I just answered it, so you'll see it in the answered section.
Answered section, yeah, okay. Are NGOs, NPOs working in India on climate action eligible to submit, or does it have to be for profits only? Anyone can submit. right? So it can be individuals, it can be entrepreneurs, sole proprietors, public institutions, private institutions, banks, universities, whoever. So it is open to all. So you don't need to worry about the kind of organization you are, the type of incorporation you have. So that doesn't matter. And I think Karthik's follow-on question was kind of similar. I've understood the criteria about the ideas themselves. My question is about the applicant. Example, needs to be or not to be a profit or non-profit. Minimum age of organization, can individuals who are yet to establish their organizations be eligible? Yes, 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 right? So you don't need to be a profit or a non-profit. I mean, you can be either. You don't have we don't require a minimum age for the organization. Individuals who are yet to establish their organizations are eligible as well, right? So all of these are not a hindrance for you to apply for the lab. All right, moving on, Emily's question. She has two questions. I'll go one by one. What role do the international financing institutions, development partners play in your network? So perhaps Hazem can take that question.
Happy to, Arun. Thank you. And thanks, Emily, for the thoughtful question. So, it's a combination, right? So a lot of the DFIs are also members of some of the selection panels, for the regional streams as well as the global streams. And so these institutions will advise us on which instruments to eventually select. These institutions are then also invited to become working group members for each of the instruments that we accelerate over the 7-month-long period. A working group essentially meets 3 to 4 times during the lab process, and you can also engage with working group members bilaterally to tap into specific expertise of the financial institutions or non-financial institutions that you're looking to sort of seek help from. And finally, the last thing that I'll say is, as part of the continued support phase of the lab, which is after you've been endorsed, you're eligible to receive 25 days of support over the course of 12 months after endorsement. The lab will also provide connections to some of these financial and non-financial institutions, investors, or sort of technical experts that you might be looking to sort of connect with. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks, Hazem. And to add on to what Hazem was saying, sometimes the partners, the lab members, also might be interested in your ideas and might want to invest in it, right? An example is FMO is one of the lab members, the Dutch Development Organization, and they had actually shown interest in one of the lab instruments called Climate Investor One. Some of you might have heard it. So they have invested in it, and it's been one of the largest investments of a lab instrument ever. Okay, part 2 of Emily's question is, do you ever matchmake solutions from applicants with development programs, governments, at the same time as they are receiving support from CPI, so that the solutions can be refined and piloted without additional financing? So when you're talking about matchmaking, are you referring to getting funding support, or are you saying that they are also offering an accelerator support like the lab is doing? So in case it's the financing support, of course we do the matchmaking. It's not like you enter the lab program of the CPI and then there's a freeze on your fundraising activities, right? So you can simultaneously raise funding, and if there is a development program or a government which is happy to fund your program, then yes, of course, we are happy to matchmake. If it is analytical support, so that would depend on what they're offering additionally that we do not offer. Like, for example, maybe they're offering more bespoke support on legal regulatory aspects of things. in a specific geography, right? Where maybe the lab does not have expertise in. Then we are happy to matchmake for that. But if it's a duplication of effort, right? So what we are doing, they're also doing, that doesn't make sense. So perhaps we would not suggest that to you, but of course you're free to, go on your own and talk to them. And if they're offering additional support, then sure, why not? So the bottom line is that there's no freeze on you to get support or funding from any sources just because you're part of the lab. I hope that answers your question. Okay, moving on. Ketan is asking, just to clarify, we are working on a general hub-based physical model as of now in India, in which forestry is one of the focus areas. So would you recommend applying for something narrower in scope or a broader program? So Ketan, what I would suggest is, why don't you, touch base with me offline so that we can probably I can point out to whether the India program or the high integrity forest program will be more suitable for you. So your question is very specific and very specific to your situation. So you can probably touch base with me after this webinar and we can discuss. Okay, next question. Anthony wants to know, would an aquacultural insurance addressing blue financing be eligible? So I'll let Megan take that question. Would an aquacultural insurance addressing blue financing be eligible?
I think the short answer is yes. Again, just bearing in mind that we are looking for financial instruments. So the question would be how insurance policies can tie into a broader funding mechanism for blue financing. But in principle, yes.
Right. So Anthony, feel free to apply because we think your idea will be eligible for the lab. All right. Moving on. Is a consortium, John wants to know, is a consortium, eligible to apply, as we have a project idea we are building between AU and EU. AU is African Union, I suppose, and EU is, of course, the European Union. Is a consortium eligible to apply, as we have a project idea that we are building between AU and EU? Okay, so we need to know a little bit more details, and because this involves Africa, so perhaps you can touch base with Megan to explain your idea to her, if Megan, is okay with that, and she can give you better advice. Because right now your question, we don't know what project this is, and like Hazem said before, we don't we don't support specific projects. It's more about the financing instruments, and that can include servitization models as well. And also, from your question, it's not very apparent, is it a climate related idea, and so on, right? So John, you can touch base with Megan and she would be able to guide you better. So you can see the email ID where you can drop an email in case you have more questions. It's on the chat window. I will continue with the questions here.
Thanks, sir. Just to
Yeah.
quickly jump in here, I will say, assuming that you sort of meet the eligibility criteria, I did want to make it clear to the audience that consortiums are eligible to apply. So we've had consortium-based applicants in the past, and some of them have also gone through and completed the lab process. So as long as your idea is eligible, you would be eligible to apply as a consortium.
Thank you, Hazel. Neha wants to know, after examining instances of lab-supported concepts, the concept being proposed should exhibit a certain degree of financial viability. Therefore, low-value crops such as cassava or regions within lower-income countries might encounter challenges in securing the same level of funding as those that have already succeeded, as the primary criterion of the lab is catalytic and financial sustainability and not development impact as such. Okay, Neha, I think there's a lot to unpack in your question. because you're talking about catalytic, which is one of the criteria of the lab, and also financial sustainability, which is another criteria. Okay. Now we are not looking at we're not looking at ideas which can bring in huge profits or something, right? We are looking for something which does not subsist on grants forever, right? So it can have philanthropic funding in the first year, in the second year, in the third year, but beyond that, the idea should self-sustain on its own, right? So that need not be something which is hugely profitable. Okay, it can be simple ideas which have perhaps they have operational profit, right? And certainly, I mean, I wouldn't say there is no development impact because of the ideas. The lab has certainly proven that it does have an impact on development projects across the globe. So, and as for catalytic, ability of the idea, catalytic ability is about, can you actually influence more others to follow in your footsteps, right? In implementing this idea, they may have some variations of the idea. They may have some, bigger scale, or maybe even the government is impressed and influenced by the idea, and they want to replicate that. So that is what is meant by catalytic ability. So one example I can give you is one of the lab ideas is an energy savings insurance scheme. It was proposed for the Latin American geography some years back, and it was implemented, if I'm not mistaken, in Mexico successfully. So the energy savings insurance scheme has now been taken up by OECD to replicate in other geographies, right? So, I mean, it was, funnily enough, the OECD reached out to us, to CPI, to help them replicate in other geographies without knowing that the idea grew out of the lab, right? So catalytic ability has nothing to do with the amount of money you have. It's all about how innovative and how suited to the particular geography or the particular industry your idea is, right? And I mean, lower income countries might encounter challenges in securing the same level of funding. Again, I would not agree to that, because you have so many sources of funding which are open. When you see the membership network of the lab, it's not about the financial institutions which are there in the lower income countries alone. It's also about multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, etc. Many of which actually do funding, which you can call as sustainable in the lab criteria. So it's not a grant. They do debt. Maybe they even take equity because the idea seems promising and is financially sustainable. So I hope your concerns are addressed, Neha, and Megan, please feel free to.
Sorry, just one more item to add. So just a reminder again that the lab only develops financial instruments. So in this instance, it wouldn't be involved with finding funding for specific crop types or development of specific crop types, but rather would be looking at financing mechanisms which could work with climate resilient, climate smart agriculture.
Absolutely. So it can be something like, how can we make, a drought resistant seed variety available for a whole group of farmers in a particular geography, right? So how do we actually provide finance for the farmers so that they can acquire those seeds and use it in the next cropping cycle or something like that, right? So this idea has scale, and for the individual farmer, probably the amount is not much. It can also be supplemented by loans and government grants and so on. So we are looking at the financial angle. We're not looking at how can we actually market cassava to different regions of the world or something, right?
Just to add a little bit of flavor here, spot on, Arun and Megan. And this is a great question, and one that we talk about all the time internally. This sort of balancing act between impact, development impact, financial sustainability, and catalytic potential. And this may not be apparent in the lab's criteria, but we really try to balance impact but we really try to balance all three. For sectors and regions that warrant, greater concessionality, we will of course be open to considering those ideas. And we take into account or we understand, that it can be more difficult to attract private capital in certain sectors and in certain geographies. And so that should not be a reason for folks to shy away from applying to the lab.
Absolutely. All right, moving on. Karthik has a question. Will submissions be reviewed as they are submitted, or will the process start only over after all the submissions have been received? So typically what happens is that the submissions, they are a trickle till the last week, and then we get a whole bunch of submissions. We encourage you not to do that. We encourage you to submit beforehand. So we will certainly start the evaluations as and when the ideas come out. But because most of the ideas are submitted in the last week, so typically what happens is that most of them get evaluated after the deadline. And certainly the long list will be announced only on a certain date, right? So we will update you on the date in which the long list will be announced. And of course, we will individually reach out to those proponents whose ideas were long listed, right? So you don't need to worry about how they will be evaluated, but we do encourage you to put in your applications as soon as possible rather than waiting for the last minute. All right. Moving on, Timothy has a question. I wish to clarify that the amount, $200,000 mentioned earlier, is it the amount your institution would provide, or is it the equivalent value of the proposed idea venture? So neither. Again, I mean, let me reiterate, the lab will not fund your ideas. What the $200,000, the number meant was, it is the equivalent value of the support which we provide, right? So we provide support to you to scale up your ideas, to do market studies, financial modeling, and what have you. So the time value of the support which we provide is equal to $200,000. We're not going to provide you funding for $200,000, nor should your ideas be equal to $200,000, right? So now, none of the options which you're given in your question is right, and I hope I've clarified your question. Okay. Shrikant wants to know how to prioritize applying to global vis-a-vis regional. Again, like I said, it depends on how strongly your idea is aligned to a certain region versus how strongly it is aligned to a thematic area. And if it is aligned to a thematic area, still you will have to indicate some geographies where your ideas will be implemented. It's not like you apply for high integrity forest and you leave the cell where you have to answer where do you want to implement the ideas blank, right? So typically you will indicate a few geographies where you want to implement the idea. And usually what happens is that, like Hazem said, we will determine. I mean, if you say you're working on high integrity forests, but the only geography you're working on is India, then we will take a call on whether the idea fits into India or the idea fits into high integrity forests, right? But if you're working on high integrity forests, but the geography you're focusing is on Malaysia or something, then your idea probably falls under the thematic stream, right? So you prioritize, and then we will take a call on whether that is where your idea is strongest. And the reason why we are prioritizing after your submission is because we want to give you a good chance to succeed, right? And if your idea is very strong on the high integrity forest front, but not so strong on the regional, perhaps you mentioned India as the region front, then we would probably slot you under the category where you're stronger. All right, moving on. Zakaria wants to know, do you support existing programs which have the same objectives? Climate change mitigation, water use related ideas. So basically, do you support an existing programs which have the similar objectives? So Megan, perhaps you can take this one.
So bearing in mind that the purpose of the lab is to help support innovation, the question would be, is the program anticipating a change which would allow it to scale up or replicate? And what support would you need from the lab in achieving the scaling up or replication? I think that would be important to the application. The lab is able to support programs with multiple objectives, so mitigation and water savings would both be accommodated. In fact, the lab supports ideas that pursue all of the sustainable development goals, but always, of course, climate action as being one of those core SDGs. So certainly ideas which support multiple impact dimensions are most welcome. So the answer is yes, but dependent on the innovation potential.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, moving on. Question from Timothy. Can an institution or applicant send more than one proposal? Hazel, why don't you take that?
Sure. That the quick answer to that question is yes. So you would be eligible to submit more than one. Although we do encourage you to choose one. I'd invite the other panelists to come in on this as well, because I think if you submit, if you're a small institution and you've submitted two ideas, one of the questions that we might have is, do you have the resources and capacity to be doing both? And so, as far as the support from the lab process is concerned, having buy-in for a single initiative, it would probably be key. But we don't have a sort of a set eligibility criteria around that. But Megan and Arun, please feel free to come in.
No, I agree with that, because most of the applicants, are smaller teams or smaller organizations, and you typically would not have the bandwidth to put in more than one strong idea, right? There's no point in spending maybe 2-3 hours of your time filling in the application if it's going to be an average application, but you're put in 2 applications which are average. There's no point in that, right? So focus on the idea which you think is your strongest and apply for that. I would encourage that. Megan?
Absolutely. And just for a sense of probabilities in the selection process, so the lab could receive anywhere between 150 and 250 applications for the coming year, and is only going to be awarding 10 of those ideas with inclusion in next year's lab cycle. So that means a very strong pool of competition, and therefore Arun and Haisam's points are very valid. So rather submit one very well detailed application. We also encourage quantification wherever possible. So if you have initial estimates of market impact, or more specifically even of the size of the financial instruments and the funding required to initially catalyze it and pilot it, these would certainly stand you in good stead if the numbers are credible and they show a degree of preparation.
All right, we are about to conclude, but before that, please take a moment to answer the poll on your screen to evaluate the webinar. You can see a poll. Please do answer that. And thank you very much for your interest and excellent questions. So you may have additional questions, or perhaps you want to get in touch with us. Do email us on lab.cpi, that's lab.cpi@cpiglobal.org. The email ID is there in the chat box as well. The recorded webinar will be available soon, and we'll follow up via email with the link to it and the slides you just saw. And we look forward to receiving your submissions.
And we promise that we will respond to your queries via email. We're very responsive during this time.
So Jenny wants the email ID to be shared again. So perhaps Rindo, you can put out the email ID again in the chat box. Oh, it's already there in the chat box. So you can see, if you open the chat box, you can see the email ID. And Karthik, yes, we can connect offline. So do email that email ID, or you can find me on LinkedIn and we can discuss.
I'm not sure that the email ID was shared with everyone, because I see that it was shared with the host and panelists, but I can't see it in the general chat.
Okay. So let me actually.
I think Windows just sent it to everyone, so we should be all set.
All right, perfect. Sorry about that, but you can see the email ID now on the chat. Okay, perfect. Thank you all for your time, and we look forward to your submissions in the lab. And do follow the page of the LinkedIn page, social media page of the lab, as well as CPI for updates. And of course, we will be emailing you updates as well. So thank you. Have a good day, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.